Your teeth are essentially time capsules that can survive centuries, unaffected by nutrition, to tell an investigator exactly how old you were when you died.
Welcome to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're here with us today. We're going on a really fascinating forensic journey into the osteobiological investigation. Basically, we're going to look at how science reads the hidden biological clocks ticking away inside all of us, long after we're gone. We are unlocking the secrets of human remains, deciphering the silent history held in our very bones and teeth. Let's get right into the science of how this actually works.
Okay, let's dive into this by establishing our core concept, osteobiography. It's a beautiful word for a, well, kind of morbid, but absolutely essential scientific process. See, when investigators find remains, they need a biological profile. They need to know who this person was, and most crucially, how old they were. Creating this osteobiography relies heavily on physical markers left behind in the skeleton and the mouth.
Now, when building this biological profile, investigators basically have two main clocks to look at: teeth and skulls. But, and this is absolutely crucial, they are not created equal. If an investigator has to choose between a skull and a jawbone, they want the jawbone every single time. Why? Well, because teeth rarely lie. Their formation is heavily shielded from the outside world. Think about it. If a child suffers from severe malnutrition, their skeletal growth might stunt, throwing off the whole cranial timeline. But their teeth? Those little time capsules keep developing on a strict, genetically programmed schedule, largely resistant to environmental chaos. Cranial sutures, on the other hand, just have way higher variability.
Section 1. The dental clocks: development versus destruction.
To really understand this, we have to look at a massive biological paradigm shift that happens right around the age of 25. Here's the fundamental rule of forensic odontology. When we're looking at subadults, so anyone under 25, we're measuring youth through the lens of development. We're looking at calcification and the predictable eruption of teeth. We are essentially watching the building being constructed. But once we hit adulthood beyond 25, the building is finished. From that point on, aging shifts entirely to degenerative and regressive changes. So in a biological sense, we stop measuring development and we start measuring microscopic destruction.
So let's look at how we measure those builders first. For subadults, investigators frequently use Demirjian system. Now, this method doesn't look at all the teeth. It specifically evaluates just the first 7 teeth in the mandible, which is your lower jaw. It evaluates them by assigning them one of 8 distinct stages of maturity, lettered A through H. By mapping out these really precise stages of dental development and adding them up, forensic scientists can convert that total maturity score into a highly accurate dental age. It's incredibly methodical.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this single number right here, 90. See, when investigators are looking at late teens and early 20s, almost all the teeth are fully developed. The only indicator they really have left is the third molar, the wisdom tooth. If an investigator looks at a wisdom tooth and sees it has reached Demirjian stage H, which basically means the apex of the root is completely closed, there is a greater than 90% probability that the individual is over 18. In the legal and forensic world, that 90% certainty is an absolutely massive threshold for determining adulthood.
But what happens when that 25-year mark passes? Well, we switch to Gustafson's method. We're no longer looking at growth, we're looking at microscopic wear and tear. Gustafson's method is essentially a microscopic evaluation of destruction. Investigators score attrition, which is the physical wear on the chewing surfaces. They look at secondary dentin formation, which is how the tooth tries to protect its nerve over time. They measure periodontosis, which is bone loss and gum recession. They also examine cementum apposition, root resorption, and finally, how transparent the root has actually become. By scoring these 6 tiny regressive changes, they can calculate an adult's age.
Gustafson's isn't the only way, though. The Lomiden method is fantastic because it's non-destructive. It just looks at single-rooted teeth to measure root transparency and gum recession, and it hits a real sweet spot for accuracy between the ages of 40 and 65. But if you want extreme precision, investigators turn to biochemical analysis. By looking at a specific chemical process in the dentine called aspartic acid racemization, scientists can often pinpoint an individual's chronological age to within plus or minus 3 years. For adult remains, that level of accuracy is just staggering.
Section 2. The cranial backup clock: deciphering the sutures.
We've established that teeth are the absolute gold standard, but when a dental record is incomplete, investigators have a secondary forensic tool at their disposal: the progressive closure of the sutures in the human skull. When a human is born, their skull is not one solid piece of bone. It's honestly like a giant puzzle with gaps, designed to allow the brain to grow. By 1.5 months postnatal, the posterior fontanelle, the soft spot at the back of the head, closes. By 2 years, the larger anterior fontanelle at the top closes up. Fast forward to age 4, the metopic suture, which separates the two halves of the frontal bone, fuses together. And jumping ahead to adolescence, between 11 and 18 years, a critical marker called the spheno-occipital synchondrosis, the basilar suture at the base of the skull, typically fuses. These cranial gaps bridge and unite chronologically, really helping investigators accurately date a juvenile skull.
So the crucial point is this. While skull sutures are great for aging kids, adult suture closure is viewed as a last resort. Why? Because it is incredibly unpredictable. In fact, there's a phenomenon known as lapsed union. This is where in completely healthy adults, certain cranial sutures just never completely fuse. They literally stay partially open for an entire lifetime. You can imagine how that could throw a forensic investigator completely off track if they were relying solely on the skull to determine if someone was, say, 40 versus 60 years old.
Now, when they do have to use the adult skull, they rely on scoring systems, most notably the Mindell and Lovejoy method from 1985. This method evaluates 10 specific sites on the outer surface of the skull, dividing them into the vault and lateral anterior systems. But here is a fascinating biological quirk. Suture closure doesn't just happen all at once. The endocranial closure, that's the fusion on the inner aspect of the skull, touching the brain, actually begins 5 to 10 years earlier than the fusion on the outside. But even with all this detailed scoring, suture closure is generally only reliable for estimating age within a broad range of about a decade.
Section 3. The Master Chronological Timeline.
So what happens when we put the highly precise dental clock and the broader cranial backup clock together? We get the ultimate cheat sheet for osteobiography. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how a forensic expert builds a timeline. Starting right at the top, at 6 to 8 months, the first baby tooth erupts. By age 2, the anterior fontanelle in the skull closes. Just a couple years later, between 2 and 4, the metopic suture in the forehead fuses. Jumping to 6 to 7 years, the first permanent molar makes its appearance. Moving right into adolescence, the spheno-occipital fusion happens between 11 and 18. Into young adulthood, between 18 and 25, that third molar, the wisdom tooth, completes its root calcification. And finally, in the adult years, the sagittal suture at the back of the skull closes somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. By cross-referencing these specific milestones, investigators can weave together a remarkably accurate biological narrative.
It is truly incredible how our bodies keep a microscopic ledger of the time we spend on this earth. Every year we live is recorded in the calcification of a root or the slow bridging of bone across a cranial gap. It leaves us with a fascinating and maybe slightly haunting thought to end on. If our bones hold our history so perfectly, long after our names are forgotten, what will your osteobiography say about you centuries from now? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. I really hope you walk away looking at human biology in a whole new light.